So our second speaker today is Christie, who is a fellow at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. Professor Christie received her PhD from the University of Sydney and is the author of a very interesting book on post-conquest Quebec, the formal and informal politics of British rule in post-conquest Quebec, which I believe is Oxford.
Oxford,
that's right. And is also one of the co-editors of the volume that I held up earlier on Voices in Medieval Archives, and is working with Professor Gauvreau on a larger project about governance in the 18th century French colonial world. And today, Professor Christie will be talking about new perspective on race, manumission, and government policy in the French Antilles, the case de liberté and the politics of manumission in the French Antilles.
In 1771, a free man of color named Philippe Fossé dit Bonhomme, a master locksmith and a corporal in the Royal Corps of Light Infantry at Cap Français in Saint-Domingue, was condemned to perpetual labor at the gallows for assaulting his white business partner, Pierre Langlade. In his 1786 request for letters of grace for the king, Fossé contended that this punishment was severe, given that Langlade had been the aggressor in the brawl, attributing this to the racialized attitudes of planters to their slaves, which, as he said, unfortunately extends to men of color who are free, either by a consequence of policy, by habit, or by the amour propre of whites. Fossé's legal troubles afford us unprecedented access into the way one free man of color understood his status vis-a-vis the culturally dominant white minority in colonial Haiti. But his words are even more significant once it is understood that they were taken up by Julien Raymond, the leading spokesman for the gens de couleur in Saint-Domingue, who, like Fossé, was from Acain in the Southern District. Raymond was clearly acquainted with Fossé's plight, for it featured prominently in his memoir, a series of memoirs, which he sent to the king in 1786. In these, the timeline of Fossé's own litigation, which began in 1771, established the chronology for Raymond's own account of the hardening of racial prejudice in Saint-Domingue. Even though his interlocutors, namely Governor Vincent and Intendant Marbois, pointed out how many of his claims were wrong and that many of the exclusionary laws had never been implemented, historians such as Gabriel de Bien and Jean Garrigues have unquestionably adopted each and every one of Raymond's political assertions as well as his time frame to argue that racial prejudice hardened following the 7 Years' War. By studying the manumission laws and the ways in which these related to attitudes to free people of color, this paper will present a counter-narrative, one which will demonstrate that laws which ostensibly aimed at limiting the population of manumitted people were rarely enforced, and that far from becoming harsher, manumission laws became increasingly liberalized throughout the 18th century, driven as they were by fiscal and populationist priorities, which often transcended those of race. Article 55 of the Edict of 1685, commonly known as the Code Noir, gave masters the unfettered right to manumit their slaves, but in 1713, Governor Philippot of Martinique proposed to the minister that henceforth masters must seek the permission of the administrators in order to make manumissions legal. Moreau de Saint-Marie had a vested interest in focusing on this legislation, which featured prominently in his 1789 rant against the political rights of people of color, as it conformed to his narrative, which emphasized how this legislation had set afoot a pattern of growing state despotism, which in his view had subverted the quote-unquote humanitarian urge of planters to manumit their slaves. Further, by extracting Philippot's recommendations regarding manumissions from his 200-page letter to the minister, Moreau sought to underscore how limiting the number of manumissions was at the core of the governor's thinking, when in fact it constituted a rather minor element in his wider campaign for moral reform in the French Antilles. The real focus of Philippeau's animus was the putative, avaricious planter who charged slaves for their liberty. And while it's true that he believed that this induced slaves to steal, he was optimistic that the manumitted would quickly devote themselves to commerce, skilled trades, and cultivating the land. The result of which was that while planters needed quote-unquote strong penalties and coercive regulations to compel them to abide by the Edict of 1685, there was little necessity for policing the gens de couleur, because as Colonel Jean Dubuc, the leader of the famous Gaulet revolt in Martinique, darkly observed, the shame of consorting with slaves and the fear of re-enslavement would suffice as mechanisms of regulation. When writing in 1727, Dubuc's perspective represented a minority view, but his ideas gained traction throughout the 18th century. However, not everyone shared Dubuc's more positive estimation of free people of color. For example, in 1731, the governor of Saint-Domingue wrote an outraged letter to the Minister of Marine, the Marquis de Maurepas, complaining that when inspecting the militia at Jacmel in the Southern District, he had found, quote, few men of pure blood because all the planters are either mulattoes or they are their descendants of such alliances. In his reply, Maurepas acknowledged these dishonoring alliances, but he refused to issue a declaration explicitly barring interracial marriages, and he insisted that whites continue to serve alongside quote-unquote blacks in the militia. He merely enjoined the governor to enforce laws established earlier which barred free men of color from holding government posts. Maurepas' hands-off approach to questions of race harkened back to Philippeau and Dubuc and looked forward to the attitude of Comte de Luzerne, who preferred that questions of race be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis in the courts. The minister's lack of interest in promulgating new laws to police racial boundaries flies in the face of current historiography, which argues that there was an amplification of racialized legislation as the 18th century progressed. Even in the wake of high-profile causes célèbres, such as that regarding Pierre Chapuisat, whose racial status had been challenged when he sought a position as a captain in the militia, the minister was reluctant to enunciate a clear racial policy for colonial Haiti, even after the Attorney General begged him, quote, to send us a law which fixes the degree beyond which descendants of Negro races can no longer be sought out. As the Attorney General ruefully remarked, as he and everyone else in the colony well understood, such inquiries into one's racial origins would expose fully 3/4 of the supposedly white population to scandal and vexatious lawsuits. Writing in 1789 on the cusp of the French Revolution, Moreau de Saint-Marie vilified the 1713 ordinance, which stated that masters could only manumit their slaves if they had the permission of the administrators. Historians have followed his lead and seen this as a pivotal moment in the power relations between planters and the colonial government. But it is unclear whether the goal of this regulation had ever been to limit manumissions. What is apparent is that this law was a dead letter in the French Antilles. Like every other administrator, in 1765, Président de Peigné, the Intendant of Martinique, reproached his predecessors. He not only expressed his great astonishment at the large number of manumissions when he arrived in the colony following the 7 Years' War, but he grumbled to the minister that planters every day, quote, torment me to grant liberties. In Saint-Domingue, the picture mirrored that of Martinique. There in 1768, Governor Prince de Vaudreuil and Intendant Bongars admitted that hitherto manumissions had been seen by everyone as a quote-unquote indifferent matter, and that the legislation surrounding it has met the fate, as have most other laws, that they have remained without any execution. Despite invoking the common refrain that they hoped to hamper manumissions, the 1713 ordinance remained nugatory until the introduction of a permanent manumission tax and the creation of the Caisse de Liberté in 1775. But even here, the supposed inquiry into the master's motivation for freeing their slaves rarely occurred, and what scrutiny there was centered around the master's ability to pay the tax. As we, Michael and I, have argued elsewhere, once the issue as to whether the individual being granted the freedom could support themselves was resolved, colonial administrators rarely contested the planter's right to manumit, and these were legalized as a matter of routine administration, irrespective of the wealth, gender, or race of the master. As much as administrators might tout that the tax on manumissions would help reduce the number of manumissions, broader populationist policies and the desire to have the manumission tax used to, quote, discharge the colony of financial burdens meant that the number of liberties increased rapidly after 1775. Again, according to Moreau de Saint-Marie, the 1713 laws had been promulgated to prevent planters like Sir Geoffroy from engaging in mass manumissions. I think he wanted to manumit all 14 of his slaves. But by 1775, leaders like Governor Dennery welcomed the wholesale freeing of slaves in testamentary manumissions, even though these remained controversial, even if these were detrimental to the property claims of heirs and creditors, because his central purpose was to fund public improvements like hospitals, road building, improving his own garden, and, as we discovered, publishing Moreau's Loi et Constitution. When the manumission tax was formalized in 1775, the Seneschal of Petit-Goâve brought to the attention of the administrators the rather ticklish problem that slaves serving in the militia for 8 to 10 years in order to secure a tax-free manumission had no legal personality. This meant that they could not serve as witnesses when they brought marron and white criminals to court. Rather than simply granting titles of freedom to these constables, as Governor Dennery and Intendant de Vèvre so felicitously observed of the planters, quote, we can get a profit from people who are hoping for a free manumission, and they insisted that they pay the manumission tax. Planters in Saint-Domingue had long murmured about the partiality of administrators with regard to the fund. Well, of course, they're giving money to Moreau de Saint-Marie to fund his Loi et Constitution. But in 1786, the new intendant ordered the criminal investigation of the receiver general. Marbois was a bit like Philippot. He was coming to clean out the Orleans stables. This litigation brought to light the accounts of the Caisse de Liberté, which constitute an extraordinary archival discovery, not least because they reveal that the largest proportion of the funds were allocated to families with 10 to 12 children. The manumission tax thus served a broader pronatalist policy, which had originated with Jean-Baptiste Colbert. But what is astonishing is that these pensions were not just given to white heads of household, but they were equally granted to large families of color. In fact, these pensions for white families and those of color were deemed to be so crucial for broader economic policies that they formed the principal justification for the continuation of the tax fund when in 1789 Governor Duchilot sought to abolish it. I'm skipping forward to Marbois arriving. So in 1786, François Bardet Marbois arrived in the colony, only to find a concatenation of events which reopened the question of the status of free people of color. Among many events, in 1787, a slave named Barthélemy struck a white man with a machete. Significantly, however, when it was at first assumed that it was a free man, he was sentenced to just a stint in the pillory, a punishment which was much less punitive than the banishment meted out to Fossé, whose litigation opened this paper. This finding flies in the face of current scholarship, which has emphasized the growing racialization of law in the colony at this juncture, as does several other decisions. This assault by a slave against a white man did not induce the Attorney General to introduce new policing regulations, but the rash of duels between white men did. The same Attorney General also sought to limit opposition to interracial marriages by barring collateral kin from registering official complaints. But most significantly, in 1787, the Minister of the Marine proposed a trial balloon which sought to eradicate the long-standing and vigorously policed legal disability preventing free men of color from holding public office. And this has never been acknowledged by historians previously. He did so in response to Julien Raymond's several memoirs submitted in 1786. But in the meantime, he also enjoined the administrators of Saint-Domingue to submit their own reflections on Raymond's assertions. What is striking about their rejoinder is the degree to which they agreed with Raymond's analysis. Significantly, they explicitly defended the Code law, declaring that by contrast with Louisiana, in Saint-Domingue, quote, it has always been legal for diverse races of humans to unite with one another through the bonds of marriage. It is true that Marbois had at one time thought to suppress Article 9 of this code, but his real animus was directed against the illegitimate offspring produced by illicit sexual converse between masters and their slaves. And Michael and I have studied elsewhere a large law case, law case, and he's actually referring to this law case when he writes this rant, very long rant about this. What he's really concerned with is they're getting gratuitous manumissions. Just as the Seneschal Jean-Baptiste Esteban argued a decade earlier, Marbois drew a clear moral and class distinction within the community of free people of color, as did Raymond himself. Those of illegitimate birth would be rigorously policed, while the productive cultivator citizens who formed families through lawful marriages would eventually be recognized as white. Emphasis on the eventually. Here, however, the administrators and Raymond parted ways. Raymond wanted immediate governmental intervention, while the administrators approached the problem much as had all the administrators in the French Antilles since 1713. They pursued a strategy of avoidance, declaring that positive law could not combat this phantom of racial prejudice. Resorting to the useful tactic of fear-mongering, they argued that any direct law in favor of men of color would arouse the hatred against the race of the emancipated and encourage whites to search out those of suspect origins. Proceeding, as they said, by soft and hidden means to eradicate social prejudice through the protracted and indirect means of interracial marriage was in itself a racialist scheme, in that it employed skin color as a register of rights claims. But more significantly, making the designation of one's racial status a matter of public opinion left the manumitted in a state of legal limbo, leaving them exposed to the vagaries of the very racial intolerance the administrators purportedly sought to eradicate. As Philippe Fossé and Julien Raymond knew to their cost, quote, prejudice was stronger than law. As this paper has shown, racial prejudice did not necessarily increase in Saint-Domingue following the 7 Years' War. I should clarify that among administrators, nor was there a proliferation of racialized laws at that time. If government intervention was growing, its focus was more often than not towards policing people of color, for a persistent strand of thinking from Governor Philippot onwards posited that coercive laws must be promulgated to better regulate the planters. Historians have been taught to think that there was a dense seam of racial laws because of Moreau's opus, Loi et Constitution, not least because of Moreau's obsession with showing how colonial governance had expanded at the expense of planter power. So I've shown the manumission laws and many other laws besides were rarely executed. One of the theoretical insights of this paper, therefore, is to caution historians against reading statute laws as a reflection of how they functioned in practice. Despite the rhetoric regarding the need to control the number of manumissions, I've argued that fiscal, populationist, and economic priorities increasingly took precedence and often transcended questions of race. Moving beyond the lucubrations of Raymond, upon which Debian and Vergas had relied for evidence of a, quote, new emphasis on white purity after 1768, this paper has shown that legislation aimed at policing free people of color originated largely in the first decades of the 18th century, and that perceptions of the manumitted became more favorable as the century progressed, such that distinctions of color increasingly gave way to a more fundamental division, namely that between free and unfree. where the attribute of whiteness was strongly inflected by considerations of wealth, class, and education. That manumissions went largely unchecked, that manumission taxes were used to undergird pro-natalist policies among families of color, and more stunningly that in 1787 the Minister of the Marine pondered the extraordinary experiment of permitting men of color to hold public office, demonstrates that a more complicated history of attitudes towards the affranchi existed in the French Antilles than the current story, which has so dominated several decades of scholarship, which posited that a coherent and linear hardening of racialized laws occurred following the 7 Years' War. Thank you.